Sheev Palpatine didn't just get rich and keep all his wealth, but he spent money on a level that's hard to even imagine. As Emperor, every credit, every resource, and every transaction across 100 quadrillion beings flowed through systems he controlled completely. And the Galactic Empire, at its height, held more people than 13 million Earths combined. Every single one of them participated in an economy that existed for one purpose: to fund his ambitions. Based on estimates, the gross galactic product sat at around 92 sextillion credits during the Empire's 20-year reign. And to put that in perspective, a sextillion is 1,000 billion billion. Palpatine commanded resources that make the combined wealth of every nation on Earth look like pocket change, and he dissolved the Imperial Senate specifically so he could spend without anyone looking over his shoulder, turning the entire economy into his personal bank account. From funding both sides of a galaxy-spanning war, to building moon-sized superweapons, from luxury yachts to the largest military in history, this is the true story of how Darth Sidious spent his unimaginable fortune and what all that spending tells us about what he really wanted. This and all following information are drawn from official Star Wars legends and canon sources. We highly recommend exploring these stories. Before Palpatine could spend a fortune, he needed to have one, and his family gave him a solid head start. House Palpatine was one of the oldest and most prestigious noble families on Naboo, wealthy enough to own an ancestral estate in the Lake Country called the Convergence. This old money gave the young Palpatine his first real taste of what credits could buy, and what he chose to spend them on tells us everything about who he really was from the very beginning. Yet, family money was only the beginning of what would become his financial empire. Even as a teen, Palpatine was already spending his family's credits on things that would make most people nervous, and as depicted in Queen's Peril, he traveled across the galaxy collecting art connected to the dark side of the Force, pieces that museum workers would have dismissed as worthless junk. But Palpatine knew exactly what he was buying, and the Book of the Sith tells us that he dove deep into black markets, using his family's money to hunt down ancient Sith texts and forbidden artifacts wherever he could find them. Every credit he dropped on these dark relics was really an investment in the power he planned to grab later. In Legends, Palpatine got his hands on the full family fortune the brutal way, eliminating his entire immediate family in 65 BBY, including his father Kasinga. His father had spent years using money and political connections to cover up his son's crimes, even buying him an expensive speeder as a bribe after one incident. Now, all of that wealth belonged to the young Sith apprentice alone, and he had plans for it that his father never could have imagined. Then, Palpatine gained access to wealth that most beings couldn't even imagine. But the real money came when Palpatine connected with his Sith master, Darth Plagueis. In public, Plagueis went by the name Higo Damask too, and ran Damask Holdings, a massive financial corporation tied directly to the intergalactic banking clan. The Darth Plagueis novel shows us just how deep the Sith Lord's financial reach really went, with networks stretching across the entire galaxy that could move money, resources, and influence wherever he needed them to go. The banking clan controlled huge chunks of the galactic economy, and Plagueis was pulling strings behind the scenes for decades without anyone catching on. He even hosted secret annual meetings on his private moon called Sojourn, where the galaxy's most powerful politicians, corporate leaders, and crime bosses would gather to shape policy from the shadows. This group literally created the galactic credit standard and decided who would become Chancellor. When Palpatine ended his master's life the night before his own election to Supreme Chancellor, he inherited all these financial networks, and the galaxy was about to find out exactly how he planned to use them. What he spent during this period was staggering. The Clone Wars might be the biggest financial scam in galactic history, and Palpatine was the one writing the checks on both sides. As Supreme Chancellor, he controlled Republic spending, and as Darth Sidious, pulling Count Dooku's strings, he controlled where Separatist money went too. And as revealed in Revenge of the Sith, nobody had any idea that the whole war was fake. Every battle, every casualty, every budget line served his master plan, and credits were flowing across the galaxy like water, while only one person knew where it was all really going. Just the clone army alone cost an astronomical amount, since Plagueis had already invested in expanding Kamino's cloning facilities years earlier, and now Palpatine was cashing in on that setup. Millions of clone troopers had to be grown, trained, armed, and shipped out, all on the Republic's tab, with Palpatine approving every spending bill. And when you factor in genetic engineering, growth acceleration, military training, armor, weapons, and medical care for 3 million soldiers, the numbers become almost impossible to wrap your head around. And that was just the soldiers. Since the Republic also needed warships, weapons, vehicles, supplies, and all the infrastructure to support a galactic military, Acclamator assault ships, Venator-class Star Destroyers, gunships, walkers, and countless smaller vehicles rolled off production lines funded by the Republic Treasury, and each Venator-class Star Destroyer alone cost billions to build, crew, and keep running. Palpatine ordered hundreds of them, knowing full well that every credit invested was making his future empire stronger while bleeding the Republic dry from the inside. But then, Palpatine went ahead and seized the banks themselves. Meanwhile, the intergalactic banking clan was secretly backing Count Dooku's Separatists while still doing business with the Republic, and this let the bankers profit massively from both sides of the war, handing out loans to the Republic for clones and warships while also funding the Separatist droid armies. Sangheil, who ran the banking clan, thought he was playing everyone to control galactic finances, but what he didn't realize was that Sidious was the only one really benefiting, spending Republic credits with one hand, while his Separatist puppets spent with the other. As documented in the Clone Wars series, a senator named Rush Clovis got caught up in a Sith trap that handed control of the banking clan directly to Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. Dooku blackmailed Clovis into raising interest rates on the Republic while letting Separatist forces occupy Scipio, the banking headquarters. When the Republic invaded in response, Clovis perished in the chaos, and the banks ended up under Palpatine's direct control. He had spent trillions creating a war, and now he owned the very institutions that financed it. When Palpatine declared himself Emperor in 19 BBY, he basically wiped out the Republic's war debts with a single decree. And with the banks under his thumb, and the Separatist leaders eliminated on Mustafar by Darth Vader, the new Empire started fresh without having to pay back a single credit from the Clone Wars. The corporations that had funded the Separatists got absorbed into the Imperial Treasury, and while the war had cost quadrillions, through all his financial manipulation, Palpatine came out of it even richer and more powerful than before. But financing a fake war was just the beginning. The military machine Palpatine built afterward would dwarf everything the Clone Wars had consumed. The Imperial military became the most expensive project in history. Once the Clone Wars ended, Palpatine turned his spending towards building the most powerful military the galaxy had ever seen, and the corporations he had just seized from the Separatists became the backbone of Imperial industry, with their old droid factories retooled to pump out weapons for the new regime. Shipyards across the galaxy ran around the clock, building Star Destroyers, the massive warships that would become the Empire's calling card, and each Imperial-class Star Destroyer cost billions of credits. Palpatine ordered thousands of them built, and he was really just getting warmed up. The Imperial Navy grew so fast that it strained even the galactic economy. Star Destroyers needed crews of tens of thousands, plus stormtrooper garrisons, TIE fighter squadrons, and support ships to keep them running. A single Star Destroyer required over 37,000 crew members to operate, along with a full wing of 72 TIE fighters and their pilots. Keeping this fleet supplied and maintained ate up entire planetary economies. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and medical supplies had to flow constantly to keep the Imperial war machine running across millions of star systems. Corporations like Kuat Drive Yards and Sinar Fleet Systems made fortunes off Imperial contracts, employing millions of workers across countless systems to build instruments of Imperial domination. As detailed in the Tarkin novel, The Emperor demanded production quotas that pushed these industries to their absolute limits. Every credit poured into military hardware was a credit invested in Palpatine's vision of total galactic control, and he kept investing without any hesitation. Still, controlling the galaxy required more than ships and soldiers, but ships and soldiers weren't enough to maintain real control, and the Imperial Security Bureau represented another massive drain on the budget that required constant funding just to keep expanding. The ISB ran surveillance networks across millions of worlds, employed countless agents and informants, and operated detention facilities throughout Imperial space. And as shown in the Andor series, the ISB had eyes and ears in every corner of galactic society, monitoring communications, tracking anyone who spoke against the Empire, and eliminating threats to Imperial rule. Running this kind of control apparatus required dedicated personnel, cutting-edge technology, and infrastructure on every inhabited world. Currency itself became one of Palpatine's most effective tools for keeping worlds in line, and as detailed in the Tarkin novel, Imperial economic policy enforced prosperity through unified monetization in the form of Imperial credits. This wasn't just about money though, it was about control, since all trade had to register with the Empire, and the currency itself became a way to enforce obedience by tying every transaction to Imperial authority. Whoever controlled the money controlled the territory, and Palpatine controlled all of it. By some estimates, the gross galactic product during the Empire's 20 years in power reached into the sextillions, and the Empire at its peak contained 100 quadrillion sentient beings, the equivalent of over 13 million Earths. This massive economy was basically Palpatine's personal bank account to draw from whenever he wanted. And while military spending ate up the biggest share, the Emperor had even grander projects in mind, ones that would make the entire Star Destroyer fleet look like pocket change. Yet even this massive military wasn't enough to satisfy the Emperor's ambitions. His real obsession would cost more than the entire Imperial fleet combined. Nothing in galactic history came close to this kind of expenditure. The Death Star was the Emperor's pet project, and nothing else in galactic history even comes close to what it cost. Palpatine shared this obsession with director Orson Krennic and Grand Moff Williff Tarkin, but the price tag was staggering, since the construction budget for the first Death Star came to roughly 852 quadrillion credits, which is about 13,000 times Earth's entire global economy. Sources from within the Star Wars universe describe the Death Star as costing the Empire over 1 trillion credits, which was incredibly expensive even for a galactic government. And while other Imperial officers thought the whole thing was an unnecessary waste of resources, Palpatine didn't care and kept spending freely on his obsession. Grand Admiral Thrawn actually calculated that the Empire could have expanded its fleet by a full third for what the Death Star cost. But Palpatine wasn't interested in being efficient, since he wanted a weapon that could blow up entire planets, a symbol of absolute power that would crush any thought of resistance through pure terror. According to the Tarkin novel, the Emperor made this project his top priority above everything else, pulling resources from across the galaxy to make sure that it got finished, and every problem got solved by throwing more credits, more labor, and more lives at it. The idea for a planet-destroying superweapon actually went back thousands of years to ancient Sith, who first dreamed up such a thing. Much later, the Geonosians designed what they call the ultimate weapon for Count Dooku, and Palpatine grabbed those plans and presented them to the Republic Senate as a captured Separatist superweapon to get initial funding during the Clone Wars. Construction started in secret, with the real costs buried in black budgets and spread across so many departments that even most Imperial officials signing off on the paperwork had no idea what they were really paying for. But the costs went far beyond just credits. By 4 BBY, the project was stalling because of a critical resource shortage, since the Empire needed a mineral called calcite from the planet Gorman to coat the super laser's reactor lenses. The problem was that mining calcite the way they needed to would destabilize the planet's core and either displace or wipe out 800,000 Gormans. But rather than abandon the project, Imperial officers, including Director Krennic and ISB Supervisor Dedra Meero, came up with an anti-Gorman propaganda campaign and staged a fake rebellion to justify Imperial intervention. In 2BBY, Palpatine ordered the devastating crackdown on Gorman, and the strip mining began. As depicted in the Andor series, the Empire relied heavily on prison labor to cut construction costs. Prisoners at the Narkina 5 facility were forced to build components for the super laser without having any clue what they were actually making. A prisoner uprising led by Cassian Andor and Kino Loy temporarily shut down all work at the complex. Human lives had become just another resource to burn through in pursuit of Palpatine's superweapon, with labor extracted through brutality instead of wages. Yet, even losing the first Death Star didn't stop the Emperor. When rebels on Lothal destroyed an Imperial facility, Grand Admiral Thrawn's TIE Defender program took a major hit, and the funding got redirected to the Death Star instead. This showed just how thoroughly the battle station was devouring resources from across the regime, cannibalizing other military programs to feed its endless appetite for credits. The Rebels series captures Thrawn's frustration at losing funding for his practical fighter program to what he saw as an impractical vanity project that was bleeding resources away from actually winning the war. When the rebellion destroyed the original Death Star at Yavin, Palpatine immediately started building a second, even bigger one, and by one estimate, the combined costs of both Death Stars, including all the research and development, came to roughly 419 quintillion credits, a billion dumped into superweapons that the rebellion would destroy. The sheer scale of this kind of spending shows how Palpatine viewed money not as something to save, but as a tool to burn through in his pursuit of absolute power, no matter what it cost. The Death Stars were only the most visible symbols of Palpatine's spending. Behind the scenes, he was pouring fortunes into something far more personal. But even after Lando Calrissian stole the Imperialis in a heist, Palpatine simply built more. The Imperialis was the Emperor's personal luxury yacht, a sleek silver ship with swept-back wings that could outrun Imperial Star Destroyers. And as depicted in the Lando comic series, it was custom-built by Wraith Senar himself, the legendary designer who founded Republic Senar Systems. The ship came loaded with advanced defensive systems, a medical bay with a Bacta tank, a well-stocked armory, and a central chamber that only Palpatine could access through a special interface. And most importantly, this hidden chamber stored priceless Sith artifacts that the Dark Lord had been collecting for decades. Each of the Emperor's observatories scattered across the galaxy came equipped with a working replica of the yacht, showing just how deep his backup resources really went. And these observatories were hidden away in remote locations where they could serve purposes beyond simple storage. Palpatine also kept the Scimitar, the ship that once belonged to Darth Maul, locked away at Imperial Facility 729D. And that ship featured a cloaking device powered by rare Stygium crystals along with hyperspace tracking capabilities. These vessels cost enormous sums, but they were really just transportation for treasures worth far more than any ship. But his spending on Sith artifacts went way beyond just collecting. Over his long lifetime, Palpatine built one of the largest collections of Sith artifacts in galactic history, and his collecting habits started in his youth when he was spending family money, and it never stopped. When he took over the Jedi Temple and turned it into the Imperial Palace, he went through the archives and tripled his already massive collection, since the Jedi had been gathering Sith artifacts for thousands of years, specifically to keep them away from dark-side users. Now, all of it belonged to Palpatine, and he kept spending heavily to add even more pieces from every corner of the galaxy. His collection included the Sith Chalice, recovered from an expedition to Malcor, the Great Crystal of Antanai, various scrolls and spirit urns, and the Mask of Lord Moment, an ancient Sith sculptor whose consciousness was still trapped inside the mask. The Moment mask was especially dangerous because just being near it could corrupt people with dark side energy, and Palpatine eventually handed this dangerous relic over to Darth Vader to help build Fortress Vader on Mustafar. Yet another massive project, funded entirely with Imperial resources. Palpatine poured funding into darkside research, hunting for knowledge that might extend his power or even let him live forever. And the observatories spread across the galaxy weren't just storage facilities, but actual research stations dedicated to cracking Sith secrets. Each observatory represented a huge investment in construction, staffing, security, and ongoing operations, and the knowledge locked inside was priceless, representing thousands of years of Sith wisdom that Palpatine hoarded jealously while continuing to spend whatever it took to learn more. His homes reflected his fortune and his absolute grip on the galaxy. The 500 Republica penthouse on Coruscant served as his residence during his senator and chancellor years, filled with the finest luxuries the core worlds had to offer. As Emperor, he transformed the Jedi Temple into the Imperial Palace, pouring untold billions into renovations that wiped out every trace of the Jedi while building a monument to Sith dominance. The palace became a fortress, a museum, and a throne room all in one, funded entirely by resources from a galaxy that he now claimed as his own personal property. All these personal treasures and darkside investments served a singular purpose, but maintaining his grip on the galaxy came with costs that even Palpatine couldn't sustain forever. The dissolution of the Senate marked the final stage of his economic takeover. At first, Palpatine kept the Imperial Senate around to give Imperial worlds the illusion that they still had some say in how things ran, and he only needed the Senate until the Death Star was finished and he could rule purely through fear. When he dissolved the Imperial Senate in 1BBY, Grand Moff Tarkin and the regional governors were finally free to wield total authority over their territories on the Emperor's behalf, including complete control over local economies, and Palpatine can now spend whatever he wanted with zero oversight or approval from anyone. The regional governors became Palpatine's instruments for Imperial expenditure across their territories. Moffs and Grand Moffs commanded vast resources, directing construction projects, military deployments, and economic policies that served the Emperor's will alone. Each sector needed its own fleet, its own garrison, its own administrative bureaucracy. Running a galactic dictatorship consumed trillions in salaries, facilities, and operational costs. Every credit allocated kept the grip of a regime that ruled through fear and the ever-present threat of overwhelming military force. The Tarkin Doctrine promised that the Empire would rule through fear of the Force rather than Force itself, but keeping that fear alive required constant spending on visible shows of strength. Since Star Destroyers patrolled every sector, stormtroopers occupied every significant world, and the Death Star was designed as the ultimate symbol of what happens to anyone who resists. The doctrine sounded efficient on paper, but in reality, the cost of maintaining terror across 1 million worlds turned out to be astronomical. But this whole system carried the seeds of its own collapse. Economic oppression became official Imperial policy, and worlds that pushed back found their trade routes blockaded, their resources seized, and their populations crushed under brutal taxation. As shown in the Tarkin novel, entire planetary economies got restructured to serve Imperial needs, with local industries nationalized and populations forced into labor, and the wealth stripped from conquering worlds flowed straight into Imperial coffers, funding more conquest and more control. Spending on oppression generated the revenue for more oppression in an endless cycle. The Empire was financially doomed from the start, since military spending burned through resources faster than even a galactic economy could replace them, and the Death Stars alone represented costs that no government could sustain forever. Corruption siphoned credits at every level of the bureaucracy, rebellions kept popping up, and required expensive suppression across thousands of worlds, and planets that had been stripped of resources contributed less revenue every year. The more Palpatine spent trying to maintain control, the more resistance he created, which demanded even more spending in a spiral that could only end one way. Looking at the numbers, Losing both Death Stars would have triggered a galactic financial collapse, with the Imperial economy crashing harder than the Great Depression hit Earth. The Empire had been borrowing against a future that was never gonna come, and the rebellion that destroyed the Death Stars at Yavin and Endor didn't just beat the Empire militarily, but they exposed the bankruptcy of a regime built on endless spending for endless war against its own people. From the family fortune he inherited on Naboo to the quadrillions he poured into world-destroying superweapons, Sidious spent without any restraint in his pursuit of absolute domination. His sextillions bought him a clone army, a manufactured galactic war, the largest military force ever assembled, 2 moon-sized battle stations, countless personal luxuries, and 20 years of terror across the stars. Yet, in the end, all that spending couldn't save him from the rebellion that his own oppression helped create, and it couldn't buy him the immortality he wanted more than anything else. To understand how Palpatine became the kind of monster who would spend these fortunes on destruction, you need to learn the story of his rise to power. And to discover why the ancient Sith Lords who came before him would have despised everything he represented, you need to understand the legacy he inherited. Watch these videos next.